Welcome to General Biology this semester. I just wanted to do just a little introduction, kind of talk about the course a little bit, and then we'll start getting into our very first lecture. So my name is Peggy Miller. If you have any questions, please send me an email. I've listed my email address in several places on Blackboard, and I'm more than willing to help answer any of your questions. So this course we are starting out just talking about some basic themes, some basic ideas that you're going to see throughout the rest of the semester as we start to kind of delve into different areas and topics in biology. Biology itself is kind of a more general science term because there's so many different aspects. We're going to talk a little bit about cells. I mean, we could spend an entire semester or two just talking about cells. We're going to talk a little bit about different types of organization of animals or plants, and any of these topics, they could be an entire course all in itself. So we're just going to spend, it's called General Biology because we're just going to spend a little bit of time just talking about some basic themes in biology and how they relate. If you're interested in any of these particular themes, you can always take courses on each of those specific ideas. So today we're going to kind of focus a little bit on how is living organisms organized, kind of how do they fit into the scheme of things, just talking to those basics. So I like to start off, just a little bit about what is biology. So biology itself just means the study of living organisms. Again, that can vary a lot. That could be fungus, that could be microbes, that could be plants, that could be animals. I mean, there's lots of different areas that you can study. But it's what are some basics of living organisms? So we're going to talk about what are some general characteristics today that are shared by all living organisms. And part of that is there's a lot of diversity. That is a big general characteristic in living organisms, is that they are very unique and very different from each other. And so diversity is talking about what are some of those differences in different organisms. And this is just showing some examples of, life is different. These are organisms found in different kingdoms. A bacterium is very different, although they are small and they're kind of oval for these pictures. They're very different from each other, which is different from different fungus, different from plants, different from animals. But despite all of their diversity, all living things do share some basic characteristics. They may not look alike, they may not behave the same, but they do share some basic characteristics that they have. And there are a total of 6 characteristics of living organisms that we're going to talk about. And the very first one is they do have some organization to them. So all living things have some organization. So the organization can range from individual atoms at the very smallest level all the way up to these large biospheres. Living things are going to be based on cells. They are the basic unit of all structure and function of living things. Some organisms, all they are is one cell, and we call them unicellular. Others are multicellular organisms, such as us, where we have millions of different cells. They're all specialized for different things, but we're all based on cells. Now, as we start to kind of move up in different organisms and more complex organisms, that organization itself also starts to become more complex. We start to see more traits, more structures. We start to see some of these new properties that they're acquired, whether it's larger brains, whether it's the ability to sense different things. They start to become more complex, and we start to add additional traits and structures. Now, a resounding theme that you're going to start to see as we start to go up different levels and we start to add some of these new traits and structures is that the structure itself is always going to affect the function. And what I mean by that is what a structure looks like, how it is formed, is specifically for a function. An example, your lungs have a huge surface area. They're very thin. The material itself is very thin, So it allows gas exchange to take place, and it has such a large surface area that we can have lots of gas exchange taking place. Even our teeth, they are structured different even from each other based on whether you're grinding, whether you're tearing, but they're made extremely hard, extremely sharp for that function of chewing and tearing. Now, this is looking at just how we can have some of this organization take place. And again, I'm going to look starting at the bottom, at the atoms. These are the smallest units that you're going to find in any living organism. And as it moves up, atoms form molecules. Molecules are found in cells. Cells working together are known now as a tissue. Tissues that work together are now an organ. Organs that work together form organ systems. Enough organ systems form an organism. And then I do draw a line here because anything below the line really is talking about what's found in one particular organism. And then once we get up to above that line, we're talking about multiple organisms. So a population is a bunch of organisms of the same species. Community, you have different interactions, so it's not just elephants, but now we have other animals. And then we have ecosystems, and this ecosystem is really talking about all the different animals, plus the living things out that are also in that environment, whether it's the plants as well as non-living things like air and water. It's kind of everything living plus the physical environment that they are living in. Now, our second characteristic of all living things is that all living things do acquire nutrients and energy. Now, the ultimate source of the energy is going to be the sun. The sun is going to promote the photosynthesis in plants, and that's where a lot of animals get the energy from. But whether it's a plant getting energy from the sun or whether it is us getting energy from plants that got energy from the sun, it all tracks back to the ultimate source of energy is the sun. Now, organisms that can produce their own energy from the sun are called autotrophs. Organisms that cannot produce their own energy from the sun are called heterotrophs. So because we cannot make our own energy from the sun, that'd be great, we have to eat food that was produced elsewhere, and we're considered heterotrophic individuals. Now, this whole eating and acquiring nutrients and breaking nutrients down and even using what was broken down to build other things that are needed in the body and various cells, all of these processes of breaking things down and building things up, even at the cellular level, is called what's known as metabolism. And sometimes students have heard, oh, well, someone has a fast metabolism or a slow metabolism. The word metabolism just means all of these chemical processes. So if you think about someone that has a fast metabolism, it just means all of these chemical processes happen very, very quickly of breaking things down and building things up. A third characteristic of life is homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is the maintenance. It just means the word itself just means the same state. Homeo means same, stasis means state. It just means we're trying to maintain the exact same state of our body. So if it gets too hot, we want to cool it down. If it gets too cold, we want to warm it up. We want to stay the same temperature. We want to stay the same fluid levels. So if you're thirsty or dehydrated, your body starts to conserve water. If you're overhydrated because you just drank a whole big bottle of water, well, then your body gets rid of that through urination. So it's all about just maintaining what's going on in the body. A fourth characteristic of all living things is that they can respond to stimuli. So my picture that I have on here is that this plant is responding to the sunlight. So it is leaning towards the direction of where the sun is coming from. We respond to things like what is the temperature, may cause us to sweat or shiver. We respond to pain. If we touch a hot stove, we're going to pull our hand back. That's a response. So all living organisms can respond to stimuli, even down to the smallest bacteria. If they don't like something, if they're motile, they can move away from it. So they can have that response. The fifth characteristic of all living things is that they have some type of reproduction and development. So all living organisms, they have to reproduce to maintain a population. If they don't, they go extinct. So reproduction has to happen for a specific organism to stick around. The manner of reproduction varies among different organisms. A lot of the single-celled organisms reproduce through asexual reproduction. A lot of the larger multicellular organisms can reproduce through sexual reproduction. There's different generation times. Some organisms can reproduce every 30 minutes. Bacteria can even reproduce every 15 minutes. Other organisms like humans reproduce every 20 years or more. So it varies among the type of reproduction that occurs as well as how long that generation time is. But one of the goals that happens during reproduction is that different organisms reproduce, they do pass on their genetic information to the next generation. So the genes that they have, the DNA that's found in those genes, are still passed on to the next organism. So they still, that DNA itself is still maintained in a population. Our next characteristic of life is adaptation, that organisms can adapt to their environment. And ultimately, an organism that can adapt, like can adapt well and adapt efficiently, is more likely to survive and stick around. So if you can adapt to your environment, you're going to thrive. If all of a sudden you got moved to a new country, wherever, if you're able to adapt quickly to these new changing environments, you're going to thrive a lot more. Now, over long periods of times, thousands of years, millions of years, organisms can slowly start to adapt and even form and develop different structures that allow them to adapt. That could be different adaptations of, I was going to say, on my picture, if I'm going to have my penguin here, it could be the adaptation of having that really thick kind of blubber to keep them warm in their Arctic temperatures. But, you know, it's anything that allows an organism to survive and thrive in a new environment is good for that particular organism. Now, that does lead into what we know as evolution. It just means a change in a population of organisms over time that allows them to become more suited to their environment. So organisms that survive today can look and are slightly different than organisms that lived thousands or millions of years ago. Some adaptations have changed and modified just as the environment has changed and modified. So just I wanted to do a quick, what are the review of those 6 basic characteristics of all living organisms. So the first one is that all living organisms have some type of organization to them, whether it's starting, down from the cellular level all the way up to the biosphere, but there is some organization to them. The second one is that they all are going to acquire nutrients and energy, and that's all going to be based on the energy that comes from the sun. The third is that they all have homeostasis. They're just trying to stay the same. The fourth, they can respond to stimuli. The fifth, they have to undergo reproduction to maintain their populations. And then 6, they have some type of adaptation, and some are quicker with it and some are slower with it. So 6 big characteristics that all living organisms share. Now we're going to switch a little bit away from just talking about just characteristics of living organisms and look a little bit at what are some concepts in biology. So these are theories that kind of are taking us of things we know and enough that we know that we can make some generalizations and basis and theories on things we're going to see in the biology world. And the first one is known as the cell theory. And as I mentioned before, all living things are made up of cells. That in itself is called the cell theory. And everyone's like, well, why is it a theory and not a fact? Well, I don't know, maybe in 100 years they'll find some organism that's not made of cells. But as of right now, all the information points to and all the facts point to that, yes, all living things are made up of cells. They are the smallest unit of living organisms, and that all cells come from existing cells. Now, that in itself sounds obvious, but before we had microscopes, we didn't know where cells came from. So there was a thought that at one point they just came from nothing. They just showed up. And it was an idea known as spontaneous generation, that cells came from nothing. An example of why they thought this, if you had some food sitting out, and then 5 days later it has mold on it. Well, where did the mold come? It just spontaneously showed up one day. And so they thought that some of these cells just came and arose from nothing because they couldn't see what was going on. Another concept of biology is that evolution that we've already talked about, that all living things are going to descend from a common ancestor, but they're going to have some modifications, some specializations for different environments that they live in. And this idea is that in natural selection, there are going to be some traits that are going to be more beneficial than other traits to different organisms. And if you have a really beneficial trait, that trait, and I say beneficial in the idea that it will help you survive, because that's a big benefit for organisms, that trait, because it now helps you survive, can be passed on. An example of this, so we have a deer, and it's going to eat various types of leaves in its diet. However, some of these leaves are kind of spiky, kind of furry, and if you're a deer choosing a leaf, you just don't want to really eat that spiky leaf. Well, for the leaf, having those spikes and hair on it is an advantage to them because they're least likely to get eaten, which means they're going to survive. And if they survive because all of their smooth counterparts get eaten, because they survive, they have that now option of passing their traits on. And what we start to see is over time, because they survived more often than their smooth counterparts, they more often passed on their genes, and over time we start to see that more of the leaves are going to be more of that spiky, hairy look to them. And that's natural selection. So individuals that have favorable traits, such as being spiky, hairy, allows them to survive and then reproduce. And then the frequency of those traits, the fact that there are now, instead of 1 out of 8 leaves are hairy, now we've got 4 or 7 out of 8 leaves. So that increases the frequency of those traits. Now, most of natural selection is fueled by mutations, because it's where did all of a sudden these leaves start to get hairy or spiky? And it does happen that mutations can develop a beneficial advantage. That all of a sudden there was a mutation in the development of the plant that allowed it to grow these random little spikes. Most mutations are not advantageous, but it gives that opportunity just by having a mutation that maybe it is advantageous. And if it is, it can pass on that traits and we'll actually start to see more of it in a population. We've already talked a little bit when we talked about reproduction as one of those characteristics of all living things, that DNA and genes get passed on from one organism to another. So it is this DNA that it's that basics of all living organisms. And the interesting part, and it goes a little bit also back to evolution, is that if we all evolved from similar organisms and then we've slightly changed and modified over time, because we evolved from similar organisms, the DNA is going to still have some similarities between it. And we can actually start to see some characteristics that are gene DNA based that shows that we did all originate from some similar organism. Because we can start to see the limbs. We've got our 4 limbs where we've got one humerus, we've got our radius and ulna, and we've got our wrist and bone appendages are going to be very similar to, say, a dog or a horse or even a whale. They do different things, but yet they still kind of have that similar basic organization of having 1 upper arm bone, 2 lower arm bones, and then a whole bunch of bones of, say, the wrist and fingers. So there's some similarities, even in development, embryonic development of different organisms. A tortoise, a chick, a rabbit, and a human, all very different organisms from each other. However, as an embryo in different embryonic stages, they look almost the same. If you had to see these 4 different organisms, you wouldn't be able to tell which one was the human, which one was the rabbit, which one was the chick, or which one was the tortoise. It'd also be very hard even a little bit later in embryonic development. And it's because there is some shared DNA between different organisms. Again, pointing back to a similar common ancestor. With all living organisms, we do have to group them. So we know they share similar characteristics, that's fine, but we do want to put them in different groups as we discuss them, as we study them. And there are 3 domains of living organisms. The very first domain is the Archaea domain, the second is the Bacteria domain, and the third is the Eukarya domain. So 3 domains that all living things fit into. Now, there are some similarities between the Archaea domain and the Bacteria domain. The first is they really are the simplest and have the longest history of organisms on Earth. And part of it is they are very simple organisms. They have a certain type of cell called a prokaryotic cell. And generally these are all unicellular organisms. So these are not advanced organisms. They are only made up of one cell. And they're made up of a very simple cell called a prokaryotic cell. So they themselves share some similar characteristics. The differences between them, organisms that are found in the Archaea domain generally like to live in more extreme environments. They like to live in freezing temperatures. They can survive boiling temperatures. They love and thrive boiling temperatures like hot springs. They can survive and thrive in extremely salty type of conditions like the Great Salt Lake or the Dead Sea, which isn't dead because some of these organisms live. So they live in very extreme temperatures. Bacteria do not live in as extreme temperatures. They live in more of the temperatures that we like, which is why they can survive in us and cause lots of issues, although not all of them are good and can actually provide quite a bit of benefit to us as well. To make something a simple prokaryotic cell, and why it's different than a eukaryotic cell like we have. A prokaryotic cell, as I said, it's simple. They don't even have a nucleus in the cell. That's too advanced. They don't have any organelle found in it that has a membrane around it. So prokaryotic cells are lacking quite a few organelles, quite a few advanced organelles that our eukaryotic cells have. The most important domain that we like to study about is the Eukarya domain, and the cells of organisms in the Eukarya domain are all eukaryotic cells. Works out great with the names. Some of the organisms found in this domain can be unicellular, but a lot of them are multicellular organisms. And we divide them, or we kind of group them into different protist groups, fungi, plants, animals, and we can put them into kingdoms, and then we can, kind of narrow them down and ID them out. So I have my question on this bottom of, there's domains, there's 3 domains, but then what? How are they then organized, below the domain? Because we know you're in a Eukarya domain, but from there, we start to look at how else can they be ID'd and organized. And so we can have the 3 domains, and we're going to eventually ID out a deer tick. But of the 3 domains, if we're in the Eukarya domain, there are several kingdoms. And so we're going to focus on the animal kingdom. And in the animal kingdom, there are several phylum. We're going to focus on the arthropods. In the arthropod phylum, there are several classes. We're going to look at the arachnida. Then the arachnida class, there are several orders. In the different orders, there are several families, several genus in those families, and then several species. This helps us organize based on physical characteristics, based on genetic characteristics. The DNA can identify different organisms. Because there's not just one type of tick out there, and I'm not a fan of ticks. There are lots of different types of ticks, and we have to look at different characteristics that they have, and we can organize it down into different genus and species. So genus and species is the most specific way we can identify different living organisms in that Eukarya domain. As we start to track and organize different organisms, we can also start to look at when, evolutionary-wise, did different adaptations start to show up. And then once that adaptation showed up, who has it, who doesn't have it. And we call these evolutionary trees. So we're looking at evolution, we're looking at a time period, and then we're also looking at different traits. So an example, if we're looking, here's our common ancestor, millions and millions of years ago, where we all started out, and then all of a sudden we started to develop cells that had a nucleus, those more advanced cells. That's pretty much anything in the Eukarya domain. And then once we started to look at that, anything in the Eukarya domain, we have all of these different groups. And then we can start to look at other characteristics. Like, can it do photosynthesis? Can it break things down? Can it absorb food like a fungus can absorb it? Does it have to ingest food like different animals? And we can start to look at just different characteristics that start to appear, and then how does that now branch off, and where did that branch off in the evolutionary tree? Another topic we will talk about this semester as we start to go through it is, what is the biodiversity of different organisms? Now, the term itself for biodiversity is what is the total number and relative abundance of species. So it's just how many species are out there, how many individuals, how many of each of those species are there, and what is the variability of their genes. You could have 1 million of a particular plant out there, but if they are all genetically identical, that's not a lot of variability in their genes. It's good to have some variability in their genes and to be different from each other. It helps them in case there's something that comes along that only affects some particular trait. Now, we do estimate that there is approximately 15 million species on the planet, and less than 2 million have been named and identified. So that means there's still a lot of different organisms out there that we just haven't named yet. We haven't found them, we haven't named them yet. And the sad part is that some species are going away. And it's the extinction, which just means the last member of a species or a larger classification is gone. And it's estimated that we lose about 400 species a day due to our own human activities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that idea later this semester. The human population, unfortunately, has not been great for different ecosystems. We have more negatively impacted ecosystems than positively impacted ecosystems. And some of the things that we've done, we've destroyed forests or grassland, we've destroyed coastal wetlands, We've done our damage, we've made our mark. But the interesting or ironic part is, although we're damaging these different ecosystems, we need these ecosystems. These ecosystems provide us food, they provide us medicines, they provide us raw materials, and yet we are negatively impacting them. So it's kind of the ironic thing of what we're doing. This is just showing an example of what coral reefs have started to what has started to happen to the coral reefs as we've started to pollute the oceans, as we've started to, even just diving and touching them and just interacting with them as, we're not supposed to. So we, unfortunately, have been damaging different ecosystems. We're going to end right there on this PowerPoint, and I will pick up in our next PowerPoint.